Okay, great. I think we'll get started. Again, welcome to this FIJ webinar, Inside the Investigation. My name is Ellen Weiss. I'm Vice President of the Board for FIJ. And as many of you know, FIJ exists to support independent journalists and news organizations to produce high quality, unbiased, nonpartisan investigative stories that have an impact. And I will say at a time when many are cutting back on support for investigative reporting, we really want to help you with funding to do this work. But the good news, we're not the only ones. So today we're going to be featuring a project that also showcases outlets and grants aimed at supporting investigative reporters and reporting. Our grant, excuse me, our guests, Brian Howey and Nate Rosenfield, investigated numerous abuses of power in sheriff's offices in Mississippi. They did this reporting with the support from the New York Times Local Investigation Fellowships, the Alicia Patterson Foundation, and of course, FIJ. So we wanted to share with you how you can apply for similar financial and editorial support for your investigation. And let me just say, if anyone's received an FIJ grant or an Alicia Patterson Fellowship, just toss a comment into the comments section. Tell us, what work your grant supported, inspire others. So let me first introduce Sona Patel. She's the program and editorial director of the Local Investigations Fellowship at the New York Times. She's got an important meeting to get to, so I wanted to begin with her. And she's going to tell us a little bit about this fellowship and about how you can apply. So welcome, Sona. And this is a one-year investigative reporting fellowship. Like, who's the ideal candidate?
Yeah, so thanks everyone for having me here. The program, I'll back up and I'll answer your question in a sec. The program is aimed at sort of developing the next generation of investigative reporters. We look for reporters all over the country who have a burning investigative story idea that they want to tell, but perhaps don't have the right resources or editing support to pull off. And so we are looking for, you could be a freelance reporter, you could be a beat reporter in a newsroom, you could be a journalist with several years of reporting experience, but perhaps you've never been able to break into investigative reporting. So we look at a variety of factors, but we are looking for folks who just need or want the chance to break into investigative reporting. Our program is it is a one-year program. Fellows are hired full time by the New York Times for 1 year. We pay their salary, their benefits. They are part of the guild, but they remain in the community where they are reporting. So our fellowship is a little bit unique in that you do become a full-time Times employee for the year. But the reason for that is we want to be able to put all of the resources of the New York Times behind our fellowship investigative projects. We edit the work, we publish it in the Times, and we make it available for free for co-publication by local media. And when I say we edit the work, our team is made up of Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the fellowship and former executive editor of the Times, Chris Davis, our deputy executive editor who came to us from Gannett. And we have a few others on our investigative editing team. So we bring on fellows, we edit their work, we meet very often with our reporting fellows. The idea is that you not only come into this program with a fellowship pitch, but we want to acknowledge that not, reporters out there, even reporters in newsrooms, have so much going on. They have so much on their plate. They have the daily demands of a beat. They don't often have the time to dedicate to an investigative project. And we want to be able to kind of spend the year with our fellows, really giving them the time and the space to like go out into the field and go out reporting. Um, and just also clarify, like when you are Times, because these our fellows are Times employees, we're covering all of the costs associated with the projects. So, that's local trips for reporting, of money needed for documents, legal support, all of that.
Yeah. We have a question. Does this fellowship, is it supporting only US based journalists and investigations?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
That's a question we
great.
get that question a lot. But yes, we are looking for
Sure.
reporters who are based in the US.
Okay. And maybe you can just briefly describe, and I'll share my screen in a minute that has an FAQ and a link to the application. But what kinds of stories are you looking for?
We really rely on our applicants to pitch us what they've got. A lot of the pitches we get are criminal justice focused. That, that it makes sense in some regards. One of the biggest topics we see are conditions and quality of life in jails and prisons. Problems within law enforcement around the country. Those are some popular themes, but we also get pitches um, from reporters wanting to investigate YouTube stars and businesses and nonprofits. So we've gotten pitches about education, about college sports, Title IX. Like it really just sort of depends on what you're working on, but we will take anything. We have a couple of key questions that we ask ourselves when we are looking at a pitch, and a couple of things that I would encourage applicants to think about. If I can share those, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
that would be great because one of the questions we have is from a journalism student, if they're interested in the opportunity, when, like, can they apply while they're still in journalism school, and what can they do to be competitive applicants?
Yeah. I'll take that question. We do tend to look for reporters, either again, beat reporters in newsrooms or reporters in newsrooms or freelance reporters who've had at least a few years of reporting experience post-college. Um, and the reason behind that, we want to kind of make sure that the folks coming into our program are really set up for success and being able to spend a year writing and working on an investigation that will be published in the Times. And I think that, it's a rigorous editing process. They're often very rigorous reporting processes, and we just want to make sure that the reporters who are coming in again have like had that experience being able to kind of really master a beat and master a topic. Um, uh, I will say, though, we do have another fellowship program at the New York Times that is aimed at recent college graduates. It's called the Newsroom Fellowship Program. So I would encourage you to check that out as well.
Great. And what's the deadline for the next round of fellowships?
We accept applications on a rolling basis. So we're always accepting applications. The application link on our website is open. We are taking pitches. And we onboard and offboard fellows at different times during the year. However, I will say we tend to, toward the kind of end of the year around the Christmas holidays, start to really firm up most of our kind of decisions for fellows for the following year. So the earlier you can get in a pitch, the better, I would say.
So somebody asked that it is 2026 closed, and so would a reporter be now considered for a 2027 fellowship?
You'll see we have a soft deadline on our website that has already
Okay,
passed, but
right.
I would say I would still encourage you to apply because we are still evaluating applications now and starting to have one-on-one conversations with some of the folks that are sort of at the top of the list.
That's great. Well, Sona, thank you so much. I know you have to dash, but we really appreciate it. And I hope this has been helpful to people. I'm going to share my screen to talk about FIJ a little bit and how you can be able to apply for FIJ fellowships, what kinds of fellowships we have. Let me just get to the top. So just for, and just a little bit of housekeeping. You don't have to take too many copious notes. This is being recorded, and we will send you a recording if you registered. So here are a couple of tips for the New York Times fellowships. So FIJ offers two fellowships, two grants, actually three grants. One are our regular grants, one are our seed grants. So our regular grants are up to $10,000. They're for investigative stories on any topic, right? The seed grants are up to $2,500. The seed grants are really for that preliminary reporting that you have to do in order to know if you actually have a good story. We hope that if you got a seed grant, that it gives you enough funding to be able to come back and apply for a full grant. There are follow-up grants as well. What makes a good investigative journalism project? That's what every application is going to want to know, right? What would this uncover? How does this advance a story that may have already been out there? Who are you going to be able to hold accountable? What initial findings do you have? What's your investigative plan? How are you going to go about proving that the story is true, right? Again, so many stories, I'm sure you've heard, that story's been done before, but if it's still a problem, there's still more to investigate. So we just want to know how you're going to advance what's already been reporting, and then a little bit about yourself. We ask you to put together a budget, right? FIJ will cover hard costs, travel, data, a stipend for your time. The kinds of things we won't cover is like renting office space or if you have to buy equipment. Again, for us, eligibility, most of our grants are awarded to freelancers, but you do need a letter of commitment from an outlet, right? We also do give grants to journalists on staffs for nonprofits and even journalists for media outlets, for-profit media outlets. In terms of format, we provide grants for print, digital, audio, video, photojournalism, even books, right? Again, similar to the other question, are international stories are they eligible? Well, some are, but they need to either have a US-based reporter or have a strong US angle, and they have to be published in English somewhere in a US-based outlet. So we do give grants to reporters based outside the country as long as their story has some distribution in the US. A seed grant, right? Again, a seed grant is for that preliminary reporting. It's not a lot of money, but hopefully it's enough that maybe if you have to go meet the source, this could pay for that. Open, for records requests. Again, we want to know that what you're going after is investigative, but you don't have to share things like initial findings. You just sort of have to have a strong reason to believe that there's actually, a story there. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Alicia Patterson Fellowships. These are a little different. These two are also only open to US citizens who are print journalists or to non-US citizens who work full-time for a US publication. Now, these grants are larger and really for larger, I guess you could say larger projects. There's a 6-month fellowship that pays $20,000 or a 12-month fellowship that pays $40,000, right? The fellowship proposal, again, they want a statement, not a book, but a memo about how you would use the Alicia Patterson Fellowship, right? What are the articles that you're going to write as a fellow? So a little bit of an outline. They want work samples, again, also a budget, letters of reference, a biography, and again, here's a link to their application process. So there is funding out there for your projects. For FIJ, our next deadline is January 26, 2026, so there's lots of time for you to put together your proposals, seed grants around the same time. Alicia Patterson's coming up fast. And we'll have time to take more questions about this. There's an FAQ on our site and a video. And if you need any additional information, we are here to help you and coach you through the process of applying for a grant. Because, as I said, our job is that we really want to help you get support for your projects. I'm just going to check quick. I applied for a sea grant. My proposal was denied. Yes, you can reapply either for a regular grant or a sea grant. We'd be happy to see that again. Sure. And then one other comment. Let's just see. Any restrictions on the news outlet that can give the letter of commitment? Really only that it's US based. I think other than that, we don't have any restrictions in terms of what kind of outlet. It can be digital, can be print, can be audio, video. So just one more minute of housekeeping. I'm going to talk to Nate and Brian for about 25 minutes. If you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or the questions. Again, we are going to be sending everybody who's participating a recording, so you don't have to be scribbling notes as fast as possible. And also we'll be sharing a tip sheet that Nate and Brian have put together. So I am really thrilled. This is an incredible project that we're going to talk about today, a project about police abuse. It's a story about a self-described goon squad of sheriffs, deputies in Rankin County, Mississippi, that spent years brutalizing people until their reign of terror was exposed by this reporting. Mississippi Today and the New York Times, these guys were both fellows at the New York Times, part of the investigative fellowship, unearthed this disturbing decades-long pattern of brutality inside the Rankin County Sheriff's Office. Deputies who routinely carried out raids, torture, sexual assaults, often with racial undertones. Their behavior that these Brian and Nate were able to document included shocking suspects with tasers, using weapons as tools of humiliation, planting evidence, and enforcing violent intimidation. 6 of the officers actually were involved in a 2023 raid that brutally tortured 2 Black men, pleaded guilty to multiple criminal charges, including civil rights violations. But what this investigation reveals was like not only the depth of the individual misconduct, but this sort of systemic failure of leadership to stop it. While some of the members were convicted and sentenced to prison, others involved are still in the department. Brian and Nate have been doing this work, as I said, as part of a series for the New York Times Local Investigations Fellowship. In addition to Mississippi Today, they also worked with Big Local News, which is part of Stanford University's computational journalism lab. They pitched in to help with the data reporting. Again, if you have questions about partnerships, this is a perfect project. So let me introduce our guests. Brian is an award-winning investigative reporter at the Mississippi Center of Investigative Reporting at Mississippi Today. He got his start in journalism in high school when the school newspaper didn't cover the issues most important to Brian and his friends. They started their own publication. He developed an interest in policing and criminal justice issues in 2018 while working as a producer for a 2018 Cal Matters podcast about California police shootings. He then went on to earn a master's degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism. Nate is an investigative reporter also at the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting at Mississippi Today. He's a 2023 graduate of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Nate is also the recipient of the Brown Institute's Magic Grant for his project Commons, a tool he and a team of data journalists are designing for investigative reporters that uses AI to analyze public comments on proposed federal regulations. Boy, we need that. So Brian and Nate, set the scene for us. Like, where is Rankin County? Who lives there? And how did you guys end up there?
Absolutely. First off, thank you so much for having us on, and thanks to everyone for being here. So Rankin County is right outside of Jackson, and like many cities coming around the turn of the century, Jackson fell on really hard times and experienced a lot of white flight, which really changed Rankin County, which had previously been a pretty rural area. Now it's very mixed. There's a lot of developed areas, a lot of wealth in certain pockets, as well as some very poor rural areas in the outskirts. It's a largely white community. It's a very conservative community, relative even to Mississippi. And we ended up there. I'll speak for myself. I started right after I graduated from Columbia from the investigative program there. I got an investigative fellowship at Mississippi Today that was supposed to just be for the summer. And that's when we sort of locked into this story. And yeah, Brian had been at Berkeley prior to that and had worked in reporting jobs in California and Colorado before he joined up for the summer as well.
Brian, anything to add?
Uh, Testament to your reporting abilities, Ellen. How did you find out about my high school newspaper?
Well, you know.
I love that.
I
No,
do
I
my
think Nate
research.
covered it pretty well. But
So there's this high profile case in January 2023. I mentioned that these deputies tortured two Black men that led to federal civil rights charges, guilty pleas from six officers. The county sheriff, says he's shocked. He's shocked. He's, to learn that his deputies could do something like this. You guys are nosing around a little bit, and you get a call from a woman named Andrea Murphy, and she tells you essentially that the sheriff is like not telling the truth. The story in Rankin County is really different. I'm going to see if I can share my screen and play a cut because you did this story also for the podcast and radio show Reveal, and I want to just give a sample of Andrea speaking. So, let's see if I can do this. To share. Okay, and oh boy. Okay, let's see. All right, here's Andrea.
It's just so common what Rankin County does that it's just like, well, we went over Rankin County, we around, we got our ass handed to us. We know better. That's the mindset that people have. Like, don't around in Rankin. Yeah. Around in Rankin, this is what's gonna happen. So we all just kind of take our lumps, if you will,
So how did you guys first learn about the Goon Squad? What was the moment when you realized, okay, it's not just these six guys, there's something else going on here?
Yeah. Well, the first time that we heard about the name Goon Squad was actually from a court filing from the U.S. Attorney's Office laying out their summary of this January 2023 torture incident that came to light. And it included a description of the incident in gruesome detail, but also mentioned that some of the deputies who were involved in this belonged to a patrol shift that had given itself a nickname, the Goon Squad, and had even made commemorative coins called challenge coins, which are popular among law enforcement and military, with their Goon Squad logo on it. But I think the big aha moment came for us back in the summer of 2023. Me and Nate and our colleague slash mentor, Jerry Mitchell, were in the car driving from Jackson to Orlando to go to IRE. And at this point, we had interviewed a couple of people who had come forward saying that they had been beaten up by some of these same deputies. So we had some signs that there might be a pattern of excessive force. We're talking about it in the car with Jerry, and he just picks up the phone, calls one of his sources, who puts us in touch with this guy named Rick Loveday, who was actually a former sheriff's deputy from the next county over, who claimed that during a drug raid in 2018, these same deputies came into his house, pulled him out of bed at gunpoint, and beat the crap out of him. Well, Rick puts us in touch with Andy, the woman whose voice you just heard, and we start talking to her, and she tells us these guys have been doing this for years. and they target people who use drugs in Rankin County. And she knows dozens of people who have been abused by these deputies. Andy knows all of these people. She talks to all of these people, and pretty early on, she latches onto our investigation and dedicates herself to introducing us to these people. And so we were rolling from there.
Yeah, so I mean, local sources was such a key entry for you. Um, you know, often victims, particularly with this kind of violence going on for so long by the police, it's hard for them to speak publicly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you guys went around building trust with them. I mean, you're not from the community. Was it hard to earn their trust?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a challenge. And as you said, a lot of our kind of critical sources were people who claimed that they'd suffered from the abuse of these deputies. And just to paint, I don't want to sort of be ugly about it, but some of the allegations included things like people being waterboarded, burned, strangled, types of violence that are truly frightening, even to hear about. So a lot of these people were very frightened. They were at high risk of rearrest. They were definitely scared to speak to us, and it took a lot of time to build trust with them. For some people, it took weeks or even months before they'd finally agree to speak to us. A big part of the process was building a network, having those initial people like Andy who could introduce us to people who were part of this community and vouch for us. That was absolutely critical. And then once we were able to get into the room, a big part was, being honest about the risks and the process, trying to meet people where they were at, being willing to go to their homes to track them down, even if they were, didn't have a cell phone or a place to live, but showing that persistence. And also just trying to be our real selves, and show them that we were committed to the story. And it took a lot of, we had to show our respect as well for their decisions to talk or not talk, and always be really mindful of that throughout the process. But it was definitely a challenge.
Great. If anybody on the webinar, I'm sure that there are plenty of reporters and people involved who might have tips for building trust with sources. Please just, throw your own, things that have worked for you into the comments section, share them, love to see them. Given the risks that people were taking, was there anything that you did or you could do to protect the sources?
Yeah, I think one of the big lessons we took away from this, especially concerning source security, is like Nate said, you have to really meet people where they're at. You go into this having this education on how to protect sources, the sort of, golden standard, getting everyone on Signal and, all of that. And the reality is that it's just tough to do for some sources. We tried like hell to get our sources to use Signal, but a lot of these folks are juggling the revolving door of poverty, PTSD, other mental health issues, drug dependence. And so holding on to a phone can be really difficult for a lot of our sources. So we encouraged a lot of them to move on to Signal and to take other precautions, but we also noticed that a lot of them were already on Facebook Messenger. And I know that Facebook doesn't have the greatest reputation for privacy, but their messages are encrypted to a certain degree. And so we sort of met them in the middle and asked them to call us on Facebook Messenger and send messages over there. Nate and I were working over burner phones as well, so that if we did have to have phone or text conversations, we were doing so on a phone number that wasn't connected to our names for our sources protection. So we also tried to minimize the number of meetings that we had with our sources in public places, because Rankin County is a really small place, and the chance of meeting up with a source at the local Starbucks and a sheriff's deputy walking in was a little too high for our comfort level and our sources' comfort level. So We tried to either meet them at their homes or to bring them over to our own homes to interview them in private.
Yeah. So you're developing sources. I know that you were reviewing like lots of lawsuits and documents, but I want to talk about another one of your methods, which was taser logs. Can you explain what these are and what a difference they made to your work?
Absolutely. Yeah, so every time a police taser is fired, there's software in the device that tracks the time and duration of each use. And that's basically what taser logs are. Um, so we requested these documents from the department and were able to get them for every active taser that they had. And we got them in a PDF format, basically just like a chart that says each use, the time it happened, how long it happened. Um, and these were absolutely huge for us because what Brian and I kept hearing time and again was victims would say that they had been tased during their arrests and that the taser had been used essentially as a torture device. They're intended to be used to try to temporarily stun somebody so that they can be placed in handcuffs if they're resisting arrest. But what we were being told was that these folks would be held down or handcuffed and repeatedly tased in order to extract information and inflict pain, essentially. And they are extremely, extremely painful. So part of what we were able to do with these logs is obviously in the officers' incident reports, there was no description of that kind of violence. And oftentimes they wouldn't describe any need for any use of force at all. But the taser logs in some cases would show that deputies who were listed as present at these incidents in the same time intervals when the arrests were taking place, their weapons were going off, and sometimes going off in highly suspicious ways for much longer than experts said was safe, or at intervals that made it clear that this was not being used to temporarily stun somebody, but it looked more like repeated prodding in the way that was being described to us. So this was one of the most concrete pieces of evidence we had to really prove that the officers were likely being inaccurate in their reports.
Yeah, and this method of using taser logs in this case, it really benefited from your collaboration with big local news. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like who you turn to for help understanding the data and kind of identifying all these like potentially problematic patterns.
Absolutely. This definitely deserves a big shout out to Big Local News, as well as the Times Fellowship, which really provided us with support that was absolutely essential. And we really couldn't have done this without them. Yeah, as I mentioned before, basically what we had was like a mess of hundreds and I think thousands of pages of PDFs. So we had to find a way to extract them, turn them into a machine readable format, which Big Local News helped us to do really accurately. And then they also helped us to try to analyze the data and look beyond, filtering for a specific incident and really try to show what these documents could tell us at a more macro level. So Brian and I were talking with a bunch of use of force experts throughout this process to learn more about the weapon and how it's supposed to be used to try to identify what would problematic uses appear like within the taser logs. So we talked with the team at Big Local and the Times to try to develop a method for searching incidents. And they developed this algorithm that looked at factors like which officer was firing the weapon, if that officer had a pattern of using the weapon more excessively than other officers, the time span and duration of use, and the number of trigger pulls. And using that algorithm, that we were able to sort out incidents where there were suspicious cases of taser use. And what Brian and I did was, well, with a lot of these, they were totally new to us. We'd never heard about these instances before, and all we had was taser use occurring in a specific time window. That's all we had, and the officer associated with the taser. So what we did was we also had the department's jail log, which is a record of every person who's booked into the jail. So we would look at the jail log to find people who'd been booked immediately after this taser incident within a window of a couple of hours. And we track those people down, especially those who were in for a charge that seemed like it would likely come under the purview of these officers we were looking at. And time and again, they would tell us, yes, I was tased. I was tased as a form of torture. And the same pattern would occur where the officers wouldn't have reported their taser use in their reports. So this became a really major breakthrough for us in our reporting.
So do taser logs exist in like every community? I mean, could pretty much anyone in this webinar get them, and like how would they go about getting them? Is it just a formal request? Is it do you have to make a FOIA request? Maybe you could just a little bit help people understand, because it seems like an amazing resource. I'd never heard of it either.
Yeah, it is an amazing resource, and I'd encourage anyone on this webinar to try to get your local police offices taser logs. You know, theoretically, yes, they do exist in every community where the police or sheriff's department uses tasers. You know, whether or not you'll be able to get copies of those logs from your police department depends on a few things, including your local public records laws and how well your police agencies know those laws. You can certainly try soft requesting. We have had some luck. You know, Nate and I did an analysis across Mississippi of Mississippi police officers' use of taser logs and learned a lot of things about the process of filing public records requests and soft requests for taser logs. You know, I'd say in some states you're going to run into issues with your public records laws being pretty restrictive about what police records are public. If you're looking at a bigger law enforcement agency, another issue you may run into is just the sheer size and number of the files that you're going to be asking for and the time required to pull all of those logs from Axon's proprietary software. You may end up with an insane public records bill. We definitely got a few of those from agencies in Mississippi in the tens of thousands of dollars. But what I will say from our experience is that spending time to learn as much as you possibly can about how tasers and taser logs and Axon's software work are going to save you a lot of time and money. You know, Nate and I actually taught ourselves how to use Axon's proprietary software by reading manuals on tasers and looking over the shoulders of deputies who were downloading the logs for us. And we ended up being able to drive around the state and teach other law enforcement agencies how to download their own logs for them, and actually did it for them in a number of cases. And when you're at that level of knowledge of how they work, you can also see through BS, you know, denials of your public records requests and huge bills and that sort of thing for all of these hours of time that aren't actually realistic. So educate yourself on how tasers works before you file your public records request.
So someone has a question, which is not about like enormous amounts of data, but actually about like individual incidents. So there aren't large patterns. Are there, you know, any specific numbers in taser logs, like trigger pulls or time used, that this reporter could look for as they're looking at taser log that's not about necessarily collapsing all the data, but just one particular incident?
Yeah, you can definitely request logs that are much more specific. It was useful for us to get the whole departments, but if you're looking at one incident, you can either request that officer's taser and the logs within it, which depending on how long it's been used for, you know, it'll vary in the amount. Or you could even ask for the taser logs for a specific time interval. Like I want this officer's taser logs on this day. And sometimes departments, as a part of protocol, will print out the taser log related to a specific incident and keep it in that incident's file. So if that's the case, they should have it readily available for you. Yeah, and that's much more cost effective.
And do you have a total amount of money that you spent on getting the taser logs?
I think that the entire department's was around like $500. You think that's right, Brian? I think it
So
was-
someone also, the same person asked if you could use an FIJC grant for something like that, and absolutely, because it potentially is sort of the proof of your hunch that something's going on there. Um, with law enforcement stories, they don't, necessarily document their abuse. So how did you go about verifying what you were hearing from all your local sources?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right about that. And as I mentioned previously, in incident reports, a lot of the use of force was omitted. But part of what we would do is that the reports would contain other information that was really critical to confirming our sources' accounts. So they would list the officers that were there, the individuals that were there. We could use those to try to find other witnesses to the incident. They would confirm basic facts like where it occurred, when it occurred, parts of the arrests that they were interested in documenting helped confirm elements of our sources' stories that added a layer of verification. The other factor is that there are other agencies or other groups within Rankin County that were documenting the incident who might have had different interests. So for instance, when people came into the jail, it's the responsibility of the booking sergeant to take a photo of that individual, have their mugshot. And a lot of times, Brian and I found that those booking photos would show visible injuries, people battered, bruised, gashes on their faces that were really powerful versions of evidence. Additionally, sometimes people had to be taken to the hospital because their injuries were so severe, and the booking sergeant wouldn't allow them to be brought into the jail because they would be responsible for their conditions. So we were able to get those medical records, which would document the injuries and help provide a really important layer of support.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So this is a big project. There's 2 reporters. I know you have other people. At what point did you apply for the various grants? When did you seek the help? How did you kind of organize I don't know, both your support for the story, obviously you had the support of the fellowship, but where did the other grants come in terms of your support?
Um, yeah, just a quick point of clarification. The FIJ and Alicia Patterson grants are actually supporting work that we're currently working on as a
Great.
follow-up to the Goon Squad reporting. But we had the support of we had some private support and I think some grant support as well as oh, we did have an FIJ grant for the Goon Squad, didn't we, Nate? I can't remember. It's been so long.
I don't think we did. I think we had a Pulitzer Center grant when we were
Yeah.
there was a period
Yes.
before we hopped on with the Times Fellowship where Mississippi Today was trying to figure out how to fund us to keep us going. Yeah.
It's long story short, we have asked a lot of people to help us support this, and have gotten a lot of support that has been invaluable to this. So we're very thankful to everyone who supported us along the way. But yeah, we're currently working on follow-up reporting to what we uncovered at the Goon Squad that is being supported by FIJ and the Alicia Patterson as well as other funders. So.
Yeah. And how did you guys divide the work? Was it there sort of like a natural, I like to do this, you like to do that, or yeah, how did you work together? Sometimes partnerships don't always work out.
Yeah, well, we've been very fortunate in that Brian is incredible and an amazing guy, and we've had a great partnership throughout the entire process.
Feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual.
Um, Yeah, there were sort of natural developments. We both had sources who we sort of built independently, so those people we continued to talk to and develop, and they would lead us to new folks. There were certain strengths that we both came in with. So Brian definitely had a lot more public records experience than I did, and definitely led the charge on that front. And then I had a bit more data experience, so I took a little bit of the lead with some of the taser logs as well. But it was definitely a challenge. And I would say one of the things that we have developed over time in our partnership is learning how to be much more organized in terms of our source outreach and file management, so that we're not just thinking for the story that we're working on, but the stories that come after. How do we continue to track all these elements that we can use in our future reporting?
Yeah. So the Rankin County Sheriff, Brian Bailey, as I said, he denied knowing anything about what was going on. And I'm going to see if I can play one more cut of tape of him speaking about those about two deputies, because you have been trying to get an interview with him, and after months of trying, you got his phone number and you just called him, which was kind of amazing. So let me just so I can share my screen again and pull up that cut. Okay. All right, so this is Sheriff Bailey.
My reporting partner, Brian, and I have always wanted to get Bailey on the record about the allegations we uncovered. We tried a couple of times to set up interviews with him, but the department's attorney wouldn't allow it. So when Brian got a hold of Bailey's phone number, he had to give it a try.
Hey, Sheriff Bailey, it's Brian Howey calling back. I just wanted to circle back with you because, we have some really serious allegations against multiple deputies at your department. I mean, we found these, a handful of lawsuits against the department making these allegations. We've found taser logs that show your deputies activating their tasers multiple times, oftentimes far past the limits of national guidelines on how many times they should be using them. I mean, this seems to be something that was fairly widespread among some of the top-ranking deputies at your department. I guess, the lead succession of. It just begs the question of how it's possible you didn't know that this was going on at the party. Yeah, I have no comment. Okay. All right, Sheriff Bailey. Well, thank you so much for your time. If you change your mind, please let me know.
So I have to say, I'm super impressed because you sounded so poised and so prepared. Did you expect him to pick up the phone, first of all?
I'm glad that you think I sound poised and prepared because I did not feel that way at all. I fully did not expect him to pick up the phone. It was a total shock. I had prepared a couple of questions and was expecting to leave him yet another message. And so when he picked up, I was shocked, and I think I sound very mumble-mouthed and unprepared. But yeah, glad we got that tape though.
Yeah. What was the fallout for Sheriff Bailey after all of this, after all of what you exposed?
Yeah. So after we published our story, there were repeated calls for Bailey's resignation from activist groups and from across the local community. There was a big shakeup at the sheriff's office. There was even a deputy who wrote an anonymous letter accusing the sheriff of corrupt practices and racism. The undersheriff resigned. The local chapter of the NAACP started the process of trying to remove Bailey from office. It ultimately failed because it's like incredibly difficult to pull that off. The morning we published, FBI agents flew to Jackson and began trying to interview our sources. The DOJ ultimately launched a patterns and practices investigation into the department, citing our reporting as one of the reasons for their investigation. That investigation is still open, though its future under the Trump administration is uncertain, to say the least. Bailey now has a slate of competitors in the upcoming sheriff's election. in total, he was this very prominent, very popular politician in Rankin. He was beloved in Rankin County before the Goon Squad came to light, and these allegations did severe damage to his reputation. He still has supporters, but his camp has shrunk considerably, and it's safe to say that his status as the sheriff of Rankin County is far less secure than it was 3 years ago.
I mentioned in the intro that there's still deputies connected to these abuses that are working in law enforcement today there. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about them. And obviously, there's a very different Justice Department at work now that has a very different approach to civil rights violations by law enforcement. So how is that impacting your story, the follow-up, the accountability for you with all this work that you're doing down there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so in terms of people who were involved in the department, what Brian and I were able to determine was we found all these incidents of abuse that we're looking into, and there would be documentation showing who was present at those arrests. So there would be CAD records that would indicate all the officers who'd been dispatched. And using those records, we were able to identify patterns of who the players were who were frequently there. But oftentimes the witnesses we spoke to wouldn't have a clear sense of who everybody was. So we didn't always have a clear picture of what their role was, how much they saw or knew. But we did find 20 officers who were present during the incidents that we looked into. And again, there were only 5 deputies from this agency and 1 from another agency who were held criminally liable. And as Brian mentioned, there were a group of officers who were let go of shortly after this reporting because they refused to comply with investigations that the department was conducting internally into the incidents we'd reported on. I should add too that we spoke to several people who said that they had complained to the sheriff directly about the abuse at the department and had gone ignored. So it seemed clear to us that there were signs of what was going on that had not been taken up. And in terms of the Justice Department currently, as Brian mentioned, a lot of that is just very uncertain at this point. And there's also a lot of local conditions that we don't quite know how they're going to play out yet, just because things are in limbo. So there's not the permanent U.S. attorney in Mississippi hasn't been fully brought into office yet. There's still a confirmation process that has to happen. So we're not entirely sure who's going to be in charge down there and what their incentives would be. I think the way that it's affecting our reporting is, Brian and I are trying to find out as much as we can, regardless of what the Justice Department does or does not do. So we're just trying to plow ahead and try to keep the public as informed as we can about what's going on.
What do you guys wish you knew when you began this reporting that you had to learn the hard way?
Um, for me coming into this, I'm an introvert. I'm not a huge fan of talking to strangers if I don't have to, which strange career choice, I guess. But I was very public records oriented coming into this reporting and learned pretty early on that in Mississippi, it's tough to build investigations off of public records. And so learning the gift of the gab, learning how to build source networks was probably the biggest lesson that I got out of this. I got a lot of invaluable lessons on how to handle source relationships and build networks and maintain those networks because we just could not have done this investigation without our sources leading us to other sources and et cetera. So I think for me that was the biggest one. That and organization.
Yeah. I'll just add, the taser logs, that was something that developed over time. I think if we had that out the gate, that would have been really helpful. Yeah, and as Brian mentioned, something that it took me time to really master is a lot of our sources were people we only ended up getting the chance to speak to once or maybe twice. But it took time to really learn how to keep those relationships going and build lasting trust with people who were facing really difficult circumstances, especially for future reporting. That became really invaluable. And so many of the stories we've done since, we've relied on sources that we met in the first couple of months of our reporting. And as Brian mentioned too, he and I have become much more organized about tracking those relationships, keeping a record of it so that he and I both know exactly what our conversations were. And that's been really key to success as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could offer one piece of advice or encouragement to people thinking about applying for grants for this kind of reporting. Just do it.
I'd say make sure that you've put in the research to determine that there's a there or that there's a good chance of a there before you publish. Just remember, especially with FIJ grants, that there are multiple windows every year, so it's worth pushing it back if you can, just to put in a little bit more time to put in that research. And because Nate and I certainly did that, we were going to apply much sooner for the grant we recently received, but ended up pushing it back just so we could put the finishing touches on our foundational reporting.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think that's great advice. And I'll just add sort of a more general comment that I think this story has helped really teach me the importance of trying to pursue investigations that are really about people who've gone unheard. I think that those make the best stories. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that people who go unheard for very real reasons that are very challenging to overcome. It might be that they are facing threats to their well-being. It might be that they are people who've been marginalized by their community or are struggling to survive in a way that makes it difficult for them to be reached by anyone, and forces them into isolation. And for all those reasons, it makes it really hard to report their stories. When somebody doesn't have a phone or a place to live, they're very hard to find. When somebody is facing real threats to their safety, it's going to take a lot more effort to build their trust. And so I would say, when you're approaching investigations that you really want to invest time in, don't be afraid to really reach for far-flung places that feel difficult to access. Be ambitious and really put at the center of it, like, who are the people who are being affected by this, and who are the people whose stories really need to get out there.
That's great advice. We do have a question, which was, how did you determine that your story was ready to publish? And I bet that was a process with your editors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're in constant conversation with your editors about this, but I think um, it was a matter of hitting a sort of critical mass of allegations that we were able to verify via public records and witness statements and taser logs and injury photos and medical records. And I think, once we hit around 20 allegations that we had verified, I think we were in the go mode.
Yeah, that's great. I should also mention that with FIJ grants, there's mentorship that's available too. So that, again, we know that people come into investigative reporting with different levels of experience, but we want to get as many of these great stories out there for, all the reasons that, you, Nate, and Brian, have expressed, which is, people whose whose voices would never get heard otherwise, who would continue to be abused, in this case, tortured, by the people whose job it is to protect them. So I just want to thank you so much for your reporting. I look forward to hearing or reading your upcoming stories. I know you have, great things going on. Nate and Brian have put together a tip sheet, and we're going to post that on the FIJ site. And as I mentioned earlier, everyone who registered, you'll be getting an email from us sometime in the next week. It'll have a link to the recording of this webinar and also the tip sheet. Again, just a few important reminders. The deadline for regular grants is January 26, 2026. Lots of resources on the FIJ website. We want to help you get a grant. So if you have questions, if you have, you're not sure if you're headed in the right direction, you don't exactly know what to put in a budget, we're there to help you. The preliminary reporting, the seed grants, the next deadline for that is January 30th, 2026. The Alicia Patterson Fellowships, $20,000 for 6 months, $40,000 for 12 months. It's an annual fellowship. The deadline is October 1st. If you have questions about applying, if you want to make a suggestion for a webinar, you can email us at grants@fij.org. And again, we have FAQs, videos to help you with the application process. Sona Patel, I want to thank you so much. Nate, Brian, keep up the great work. We so appreciate what you're doing. And yeah, we look forward to seeing your next stories. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Take good care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.